Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for the invitation. It's really a pleasure to be here. So my group is quite strongly interested in understanding the materials chemistry of the solid electrolyte interface formed on lithium metal anodes in liquid electrolytes. And I'm going to start my talk with perhaps an unusual graphic for a battery seminar, which is the well-known volcano plot used in electrocatalysis. So why am I starting here? So these plots, so for example, show the kinetic activity of a catalyst as parameterized by the exchange current as a function of a material descriptor, the metal hydrogen bond strength in this case. And I think we must acknowledge how much of a unifying framework this volcano plot perspective has provided to the field. So it's really given an organizing principle for describing a key performance metric in the field and its principal governing factors. So much so that people have really continued to work on it and refine it over decades. And so why this has been so powerful in that field is because it's provided quantitative, descriptive, and predictive understanding. And the key ingredients are really that you must have two quantitative axes. So one relating a key performance metric and one relating a material parameter. And so I say this by way of comparison to the SEI. So another key ingredient is a well-behaved system. And that has been something that we have struggled with and still continue to contend with in the field of SEI research. So the reason that we don't see commercial use of lithium anodes today is that, as we all probably know, lithium is extraordinarily reactive. And it's so much so that all of our organic electrolyte components, both the solvent and salt anions, are thermodynamically unstable in contact with it. So when fresh lithium contacts the electrolyte, a reaction takes place where the decomposed electrolyte products build up on the surface, forming what's called the solid electrolyte interface, or the SEI. And this layer is electronically insulating, so it builds up until electrons can no longer tunnel through it to reach the electrolyte. So it winds up having a nanoscale thickness of a few to tens of nanometers, depending on the electrolyte. Fortuitously, this SEI is conductive to lithium ions, so you can subsequently plate lithium underneath it and strip it in the reverse process. So it's essential that the SEI be as thin as possible so that lithium transport is not strongly impeded through it. But it's also because forming the SEI requires consuming some of the active lithium inventory from the cell, and then this therefore decreases the usable capacity. So we also need the SEI to support uniform lithium flux and be mechanically robust to accommodate the large volume changes that can occur from lithium metal plating and stripping. Otherwise, we have SEI breakage and we need to repair it. So although, of course, the SEI is also quite critical to the function of graphite, graphite does not go undergo such extreme volume changes. And so getting the SEI right on lithium is really a lot more challenging. So because the SEI is derived from the electrolyte, each electrolyte will lead to a different SEI. And there are different models to describe the microstructure. So here I indicate the very well-known mosaic model from Peled, but we also have, for example, layered SEI that form in certain circumstances. We also have observed in other circumstances local crystallinity or crystallites embedded in a kind of amorphous matrix. And I'll just emphasize that these are models because there's really so much that we still don't understand fully about the SEI. But common among all of these models are some basic physics. So we know that closest to the lithium SEI interface, only the most reduced ionic materials are stable. So you tend to see an inner layer comprising primarily lithium fluoride and lithium oxide. And this is simply because most of our electrolytes contain fluorine and oxygen. Now, closer to the electrolyte interface, you see instead primarily partially reduced organic phases from the electrolyte solvent, and it will be quite solvent dependent. So the key performance metric for lithium cyclability is coulombic efficiency. We measure it by constructing a cell with a copper current collector, as shown here, and an opposing lithium reservoir electrode that's not explicitly shown in the schematic. We first plate a known capacity Q1 of lithium onto the copper by applying a reducing potential, and an SEI will form as indicated in green. We then strip the metallic lithium and remove all of the reversible lithium, which leads us to a second capacity Q2. And then in the simplest case, the Coulombic efficiency is simply the ratio of these two, Q2 over Q1. There are other ways to measure CE, but this is one of the simplest by way of introduction. So because we don't recover all of the lithium that we put down, there's always some residual material left behind on the copper current collector. So normally this should just be the SEI as shown here in this particular example. And hence, when you strip the reversible lithium, the extent of SEI formation directly determines the Coulombic inefficiency. What actually happens, as we now understand quite well, is some metallic lithium can also become stranded in the SEI during stripping due to pinching off and electronic disconnection from the current collector underneath. And so in the most general case, capacity loss can be partitioned into ionic SEI lithium plus, but also this stranded electronically disconnected lithium zero, also referred to in some contexts as dead lithium. And, it kind of probably doesn't need to be overemphasized here, but the room to play with here is exceedingly small. So we require a Coulombic efficiency of 99.98 or higher to reach 1,000 cycles without exceeding 80% capacity loss. So that's extremely exacting. And nowadays, the Coulombic efficiency is closer to around 99.6 or 99.7%, but we are not yet seeing 99.95, let alone 99.98 or higher. So with this background, it really motivates or underscores the fact that we have to get the SEI exactingly right. But what are the design principles for an SEI? So it turns out that we don't fully understand this, and this is because the SEI is simply so hard to characterize. It's very thin and fragile and air reactive. So figuring out basic things like even still getting a complete picture of its composition is still non-trivial in 2026 using especially typical spectroscopy methods, which tend to only look at a part of the sample and are not sufficiently quantitative. So I do want to say that this is starting to change. So I often tell my students, I think we've entered an era of quantitative SEI science where we're really seeing the emergence of a number of different proposed correlations that rest upon various proposed descriptors of SEI performance. So in my talk, I'll be alluding or getting more into detail for two of these shown here. One is a functional metric looking at the lithium exchange through the SEI. Another is a compositional metric. I'll also acknowledge some beautiful work from others. So this is from Atsuo Yamada and his group that proposed that the redox potential of lithium plating and stripping, which varies depending on the electrolyte, correlates quite nicely with the Coulombic efficiency of lithium plating and stripping also. So it's interesting that we start to see various frameworks, alluding to the very first slide I started with, that help us start to move towards being quantitative, descriptive, and predictive. But they're not unified yet. And so this is, one of the, I think, frontiers of the topic. One thing that you'll notice is, at least among these that I've shown here, they tend to have a similar qualitative shape. So a steeper slope followed by a more shallow slope as you get towards higher Coulombic efficiency. That's interesting. We call this a hockey stick correlation. And you tend to also see the transition point always around, let's say, a CE of 90% or so. So it's very interesting to understand, it's not outrageous to think that these descriptors would not be independent of one another, right? There's a correlation between them. And so are we probing the same physical characteristics? Most likely. So this is something that we're delving deeper into separately. But just to say, I think we're starting to build out these frameworks, and so it's a very exciting time. So one way to powerfully get insight into the SEI that's emerged in recent years is to exploit the fact that this irreversible material accumulates on the copper current collector after cyclical plating and stripping. So the sample contains dead lithium, and so if you react it with water, and this is work by Shirley Meng's group a number of years ago, you can quantitatively count the moles of hydrogen evolved, and then with some simple stoichiometric relationship, back calculate the amount of dead lithium that was left behind on the sample after a stripping step, and determine an effective capacity loss corresponding to that particular phase. So, and I'll get a little bit more into that in a second, but they also then assumed that the anything not quantified and attributed to lithium zero must correspond to SEI, and so you could predict or estimate the amount of SEI remaining on the current collector simply as the difference between what the potentiostat measured and the dead lithium. Our group has been interested in expanding the ability of titrations to tell us more about the SEI composition. So I'll talk about some of our works to develop acid titration and additional methods. One of the nice things about acid titration is we have a number of SEI phases that undergo selective reactions with acid to evolve characteristic gases. So similarly, we can look at their evolution by gas chromatography, CO2 evolving phases from semi-carbonates or lithium carbonate. We'll see hydrocarbons evolve from alkylithium phases, and for example, acetylene gas evolved from lithium carbide. And then we can do similar analysis and compute the effective capacity loss that corresponds to these phases. We call that partitioning of SEI capacity loss. Before I do that, I want to introduce some of the important findings that we learned from earlier work by Shirley Meng's group on water-based titration gas chromatography, or TGC. So as mentioned, you have the potentiostat measured capacity loss. What you're able to measure from the potentiostat is the reversible lithium. Then using TGC, you can quantify inactive lithium, and then the assumption is that everything that's not measured directly is attributable to the SEI. And so they found, quite importantly, this is a study, quite famous, spanning multiple electrolytes and ranked in order of lower to higher Coulombic efficiency from top to bottom. And so the key finding there was that as you go from lower to higher Coulombic efficiency, the proportion of capacity loss corresponding to blue, which is the unreacted metallic lithium zero, goes from quite large to quite small. So at low Coulombic efficiency and going to moderate Coulombic efficiencies, you're really governed by dead lithium. But at some point when you get to higher performance, you start to be governed by SEI losses. Okay, so minimizing dead lithium is important in certain Coulombic efficiency regimes. In the very high performance regimes, it's really about getting the SEI exactly right. So just to come back, talk a little bit about the workflow with acid titration. It's a little bit more involved, but it also opens up new quantification possibilities for us. So we take a cycled copper electrode, always ending on a stripping step, do a bit of rinsing, dry it, and then inject the acid, and then the characteristic gases are evolved, as I introduced previously. So we can then gain further information from what's left behind in the liquid phase, and that's because all the lithium content simply dissolves. It doesn't evolve as a gas, of course. So we can do things like use ICP, AES to quantify the total amount of lithium that made it to our analysis vial, and that allows us to pretty much have the denominator right. We know how much total material we're actually evaluating, and that can be helpful if we have, for example, soluble SEI phases that might escape the surface during cell cycling. We can also use ICP to look at anion-derived phases, and we also do NMR analysis to quantify the lithium fluoride present in the original sample. So the key point here is that with known stoichiometry between the generation of these phases and the amount of lithium consumed to have them originally exist in the SEI, we can really expand the amount of capacity loss attribution that we're able to do. So this is simply an example data set from a few years back now. We were looking at just a simple carbonate electrolyte. We cycled over like 1 to 7 or 8 cycles. And so that's why you see some scatter here. But basically, we find that the various capacity loss modes, so lithium zero, this is CO2 evolving phases, carbide, and alkylithium, accumulate linearly in the sample with accumulated capacity loss, as would make sense. Again, with known stoichiometry, we can back calculate the effective capacity loss. One thing I want to comment on is in almost all of these cases, this is a pretty unambiguous reaction stoichiometry that gets us from the detected gas to the lithium consumed to form that original SEI phase over here. The exception and where we've had a little bit of trouble is in the CO2 evolving phases. So the stoichiometry between a semicarbonate evolving CO2 and lithium carbonate evolving CO2, and the amount of lithium in that phase can vary by a factor of 2. So this is a known issue. We're actually working separately on that and have developed or have in progress a titration that can differentiate semicarbonates and lithium carbonates. But in our earlier work, we had to make an assumption about this stoichiometry and try to be pretty transparent about that limitation. So I always like to point that out. Okay, so with those data sets, we can, because we find that the partitioning doesn't change all that much over cycling, we can come up with an average effective partitioning of capacity loss in early cycling over that given electrolyte. So in this first study, we reported that we could resolve about 70% of the capacity loss of the sample, with the majority in the carbonate electrolyte going to an active lithium. And zooming in now on the SEI composition, we were able to chemically attribute around a third of the SEI to these phases that evolve gases under TGC or lithium fluoride containing phases. So that was a good starting point, and it started, allowed us to start to kind of look at how the SEI composition would change under cycling conditions. But you'll see that there's a large gray region here that was unresolved. So what this corresponds to are SEI phases that simply are not acid reactive and don't have reporting molecules upon the titration. And so what are those? They are polymeric SEI materials, for example. You could think about alkoxides potentially, but a major phase was lithium oxide. So I started out introducing that the two key ionic phases in the SEI are lithium fluoride and lithium oxide. We have the ability to measure this. So far, we really didn't have the ability to see anything about lithium oxide on the same metric. And so we took that as a challenge and focused on developing a capability that would allow us to similarly quantitatively titrate lithium oxide. So we developed a new titration, and we showed that by using butoxyethanol as the titrant, we can selectively convert lithium oxide to lithium hydroxide, and then measure it using actually a pretty simple approach, a Karl Fischer titrator in our lab. And the Karl Fischer titrator detects the lithium oxide effectively as water in the sample. And so using that, and if you are very careful to ensure that you don't have any contaminating lithium oxide originally in the sample, you can back calculate the amount of lithium oxide originally present. And so this is just showing some of the careful calibration work we did. I won't spend too much time here. And so I'll come back to some of the data enabled by this new titration in just a moment. But armed with this new expanded toolbox, we wanted to look across a broad range of electrolytes to try to understand which SEI phases most strongly correlate with coulombic efficiency. So from this is a graph of the evolution of high performance electrolytes over time. In fact, we continue to update it, and we need to now add a couple of years. But you'll see that very recently, in the last 5 or 7 years or so, we've really populated this space with quite a large number of high performance electrolytes, exceeding 99% or so. What you'll notice if you look at all of these acronyms is that we're effectively almost always relying on lithium FSI as the high performance salt, and additionally on highly fluorinated electrolyte constituents. So that includes fluorinated additives and solvents, and fluorinated ethers and diluents. We also rely on electrolyte design strategies, either high concentration or localized high concentration, that promote effective ion pairing of the FSI in most cases with lithium, which promotes its reactivity. So it's not perhaps surprising that we tend to observe lithium fluoride in the SEI using methods like XPS. And it's become a rule of thumb that increasing fluorination in the SEI is really the unique pathway to reach higher performance, at least until a couple of years ago. So now for the first time, we actually have a platform that allows us to question this assumption. So we selected 10 diverse electrolytes and conducted capacity loss analysis using our titration methods. And the capacity loss breakdown for these electrolytes is shown here. I'll just mention, by the way, in this data set, we intentionally selected quite diverse electrolytes. So we have carbonates, ethers, localized high concentration electrolytes, and then with and without additives. So we looked at FEC and we looked at nitrate. Okay, so spanning an abysmal coulombic efficiency all the way up to 99%. So here you see the example of how these capacity loss breakdowns look. We change the electrolyte. We see different ranking of different loss modes. And then all of the data for the 10 electrolytes are shown at right, ranked in the order of lowest to highest Coulombic efficiency from bottom to top. So first, I want to emphasize that in some of these cases, we're now able to really resolve an unprecedented degree of the capacity loss, in some cases quite close to or really at 100%. The gray regions are, as I mentioned, remaining phases that we cannot resolve, but we're working on. And so, I think this was a huge leap forward from where we started in our earlier work just using acid titration alone. So you can see right away a few trends by eye. The first, as shown here in blue, is that the capacity loss attributable to lithium zero decreases as you go from lower to higher Coulombic efficiency, as we would expect, and we know that that should be the case based on prior reports. But now you can also start to see some interesting trends in the SEI itself. And in particular, by eye, you start to see the preponderance of this golden phase shown here, which is our lithium oxide that's newly resolved using the titration that I just introduced. So to avoid human bias, and it can be difficult to interpret all these statistics across a data set, we use a statistical analysis. So we conduct a rank analysis, and for each detectable phase, we rank in order of the amount of that phase, as shown on the x-axis, and then the rank in terms of Coulombic efficiency, as shown here. So across the entire data set, the three with the strongest correlations are pulled out here. So the Spearman rank correlation coefficient ranges from -1 if it's a perfectly anti-correlated relationship to +1 if it's perfectly correlated. So we indeed see an anti-correlation or a negative correlation between Coulombic efficiency and dead lithium, as we would expect. And we indeed also see a positive correlation between lithium fluoride content in the SEI and Coulombic efficiency. But the key finding was that the strongest positive correlation was not with lithium fluoride, it was with lithium oxide. We observed that with a high degree of statistical significance. We further expanded the data set and populated this correlation even further and really emphasizes the relationship between lithium oxide rank and Coulombic efficiency rank. So with that in mind, we also revisited the question of why the FSI anion appears to be such a great choice for high-performance electrolytes. And so we conducted an experiment using a typical localized high-concentration electrolyte. And at the typical salt concentration for the LHCe, you drive ion pairing between FSI and lithium. But at lower concentrations, you're not yet in the ion paired state. And you can see that as shown here, the diffusivities don't correlate initially. So we examined from this lower concentration up to the point where they start to correlate. The solvent here was DMC and the diluent was TTE. And so you can see that as we increase the salt concentration from below the state of ion pairing to where we drive ion pairing, the Coulombic efficiency increases quite substantially. And now we can use titration to actually see what's going on under the hood. So the bottom graph here are relatively minor phases if you look at the percentages here. So indeed, you start to see like more CO2 evolving phases due to reactivity of the DMC. But the major phases are shown up here. So as we start to drive ion pairing of the FSI, you see an uptick in the lithium fluoride formation in the SEI, as you would expect. But you also see a marked increase in the lithium oxide formation in the SEI. And in fact, it's about twofold compared to that of lithium fluoride. Well, we also observe that sulfur-containing phases increasingly become incorporated into the SEI, as you would expect. So the key message here is that lithium fluoride is not the only reason, of course, why this salt seems to form a good SEI. We think that the oxide is a big part of it, consistent with our correlation results. Okay, so our titration methods have also allowed us to gain insight into correlations between certain SEI phases and dead lithium. So it's been reported that using CO2 gas as a cell additive has led to improved cycling stability of lithium previously. But this was really only known for a quite limited set of electrolytes, typically PC. And the reasons behind it were not well known, I would say, at the time of reporting. And so to examine this point further, we selected a set of electrolytes spanning 3 typical carbonate electrolytes, an ether, and an LHCe. And this shows now the Coulombic efficiency without any CO2 present, so just with argon in the cell at left. And then we assembled cells with a gas headspace flushed with CO2 as the gas additive. And the second bar in each of these shows the resulting Coulombic efficiency. So we validated that in 4 out of 5 cases, you see indeed an increase in the Coulombic efficiency when we have CO2 present in the cell. The exception is this over here, the LHCe, where we started with a high Coulombic efficiency and we ended high. So we saw a negligible impact. So now we have kind of a playground, if you will, to try to understand what's going on under the hood. So we use our titration methods to examine the capacity loss partitioning between dead lithium and SEI for each electrolyte. So this graph is a little complex, but the y-axis is showing the total change in capacity loss before and after CO2 for each electrolyte. So a value that's below the x-axis here, so anything negative, means that the capacity loss corresponding to that mode decreased. So the solid bar in each case is the total capacity loss. And so you see that in 4 out of the 5 cases, the total capacity loss decreased, corresponding to a higher Coulombic efficiency, and we did not see a change in the LHCe case. But next to it, you can see now whether this change was attributed to a decrease in dead lithium, as shown in gray, or a decrease in SEI content, as shown in blue. And the key takeaway here is that in the 4 cases where we saw significant decrease in capacity loss overall, the efficiency gain was due primarily to a decrease in dead lithium formation, right? So the majority of this is due to the silver bar rather than the blue. On the other hand, this 5th electrolyte here initially exhibited very little dead lithium, and so there was not much to change with the addition of CO2. And so this graph attempts to bring it all together. So this first plots the relationship in the absence of CO2 between the capacity loss partitioning to an active lithium and the Coulombic efficiency. And you see a nice negative trend as shown here. Again, this is consistent with the observation from Shirley Meng's group originally reported. And so what happens when we add CO2? We actually shift down and to the right. Okay, so and we're still following basically the same physical relationship, which is what's kind of satisfying. But now we decrease dead lithium, and so we shift down into this lower regime here and higher Coulombic efficiency regime shown here. The one that doesn't change are these triangles here, and that's corresponding to the LHCe. So there was no dead lithium to really decrease, or not much, upon addition of CO2, and so you see negligible impact of this additive. So in summary, samples that initially had high dead lithium benefited from CO2-derived phases in the SEI, which led to a decrease in that capacity loss mode. And for samples that didn't have much lithium zero to begin with, there was nothing to change, more or less. And so the performance remained high, but it also didn't improve. So to our knowledge, this is one of the first, if not the first, demonstrations that a specific SEI phase can affect dead lithium formation, and in fact can be quite effective at minimizing it. So that was quite an interesting learning point for us. So beyond studying capacity loss partitioning, we're increasingly using this approach to study the dynamic evolution of the SEI. And so I'll just introduce this through the lens of a model study that's still underway, but soon to be hopefully making its way out to the world. So we chose 3 well-known electrolytes. In this case, we're looking at 3 carbonate electrolytes, LP40, and then LP40 with either a VC additive or an FEC additive. And so the Coulombic efficiency trajectory over the first handful of cycles, let's say 25 cycles or so, is shown here. For LP40, we see an initially okay Coulombic efficiency, but a gradual decline before stabilizing after around 10 cycles or so. When we add FEC, we see a marked stabilization in cycling. And on the other hand, when we add VC, we see that initially it follows the trajectory of the LP40, but then eventually we start to see much more erratic cycling as shown here. Okay, so this invites 2 questions that we hope to answer. The first is, why is cycling more stable with FEC? And what makes VC cycle erratically? And we hope to answer this through the lens of our titration analyses. And so we did exactly that. We now took parallel samples and did our titrations. And here we focused so far in this graph principally on the partitioning between dead lithium and SEI. So in each of these graphs on the top here, you see a representation of the cycling stability. And then in the middle graph, you see for each electrolyte, the blue or the yellow or green are the total accumulated capacity loss. So since we're continuing to accumulate material on the current collector due to a finite Coulombic inefficiency, this increases over cycling. But then below it, you see also the rate of accumulation of dead lithium versus SEI. So one thing to note first is that in all three of these cases, the amount of SEI is pretty comparable. Okay, so we see similar amounts. That's, so that the differences in cycling are not obviously attributable to vast differences in SEI thickness or accumulation. But what really makes a difference is the dead lithium. So we see in the LP40 case and the VC case that the majority of the capacity loss goes to lithium 0. This is further emphasized by this fraction of cumulative capacity loss shown here. And then the exception here is the FEC. The FEC seems to effectively minimize the dead lithium formation, and so you have roughly comparable proportions of SEI and dead lithium. So we think that answers the first question. FEC improves Coulombic efficiency by lowering inactive lithium. Of course, we're interested in understanding the SEI characteristics that allow it to do so, and that's ongoing work, but here's a snapshot of what we understand so far. So we can further do titration analyses and gain some additional insight into the SEI. Here's what we've seen so far. So the first thing, I'll start with actually the phosphorus down here. So we see, independent of the electrolyte, we see similar amounts of phosphorus incorporated into the SEI. But you'll notice that when we look at the lithium fluoride, we see an obviously larger amount of lithium fluoride from the FEC additive, as we would expect. So together, this tells us that the amount of salt anion incorporation into the SEI is largely unaffected by the additive, but that the amplified amounts of FEC are really coming from, of lithium fluoride are really coming from the FEC. Okay, so that's one difference. Another difference is if we look at the organic phases. So we see roughly comparable amounts of alkyl lithium phases and carbide across the three systems. The one area where we see a notable difference is in the VC additive. So although this may not look overwhelmingly different at first glance, this is about a 50% higher semicarbonate SEI composition compared to the other two cases, just after 6 cycles or so. And so we believe that the semicarbonates and their known instability are an underlying cause as to why the VC electrolyte cycles less stably than the others. We also see this bear out in the impedance spectroscopy. So we see our baseline is LP40 as shown here, and it cycles pretty stably. But when we add FEC, we see relatively minor change. In fact, we see slightly lower charge transfer resistance. And so that makes sense given the stable cycling and higher Coulombic efficiency. And the exception is really in VC as shown here. So we see quite erratic evolution in the surface resistance. It actually starts high and decreases over time. And so we think that this is related to the increasing unstable SEI phases, as indicated previously, over cycling. So more work, still to be done on that, but that's just to emphasize that we can start to see changes in the the electrode residuals over time too. Okay, beyond understanding the SEI composition, we've been working to identify quantitative descriptors that tell us about SEI function. So we became interested in a parameter called the exchange current density, maybe well known to many of you. In electrocatalytic systems, this measures the rate at equilibrium at which charge transfer occurs between the bulk solution and the electrode. And you generally want this to be high for facile kinetics, and the measurement of exchange current in that field is relatively straightforward using conventional methods. When we have an SEI present, of course, things are much more complicated. So the SEI is going to govern the rate at which solvated lithium ions desolvate, then transport through the SEI, and then undergo an electron transfer to plate and become metallic lithium. So this is all coupled together. And we're no longer looking just at simple kinetics in this picture. However, there's no established method to really measure exchange with a reacted surface film present, or at least the approach was not obvious. So we set about trying to do that, and we reasoned that if we could figure out how to measure this, we could investigate it and see how it relates to cyclability. I want to emphasize that we call this a pseudo lithium exchange current to really make the point that this is mediated by kind of coupled processes. We're not making a claim as to which is rate limited. We're kind of measuring the lump sum of them in this approach, and it's distinct from the exchange current that you would measure in a purely kinetics controlled situation. So for the sake of time, I won't go into all the gory details, but we developed two methods to measure the exchange current with an SEI present. And again, we refer to this as J0 pseudo, just to emphasize here. And both of these involve cycling lithium to expose a fresh surface, so we get rid of any pre-passivated layers, and then we probe the exchange current modulated by the SEI that reforms. So one of these methods is based off of cycling with periodic electrochemical impedance. We do a fitting to the measured results as shown here, and then we can extract an estimate of the exchange current as shown here. And the second is based on TAFL analysis. Here we are doing cyclic voltammetry, plating and stripping lithium onto a bare copper current collector and cycling. Rather a plated lithium surface on a copper current collector and then stripping. If you'd like to see more details, I refer you to the publication that gets into this in a lot more depth. So we investigated this for 9 diverse electrolytes shown by the different colored dots as shown here. And I'll show you the compositions in just a moment. But the important thing here is that we found that we have a good correspondence. In other words, the two methods agree numerically as long as we control for the amount of cycled capacity. So that's what these numbers indicate here. So if we cycle by CV to the same cycled capacity as we do with impedance, we tend to see that these methods agree, meaning that there seems to be some representative value of J0 that we can extract that's truly representative for these SEI. So now when you plot the Coulombic efficiency versus the exchange current, we observe a clear positive correlation. And here you see the different electrolyte compositions in this study annotated here. So in other words, increasing the exchange current of the SEI correlates with increasing Coulombic efficiency. And that would make sense if we're basically improving SEI transport. We would expect that to support more homogeneous lithium flux, less breakage, and therefore higher Coulombic efficiency. So one of the interesting phenomena that we observed in this study is that in some cases, as these 5 first electrolytes show here, as we continued to cycle lithium, we were able to measure a J0 value that was largely independent of cycling condition. So it was pretty flat. And that told us, if we look at the ratio over a certain cycle number compared to the original cycling, we see that it's basically not changing. So it's meaningful in that case to talk about there being a single representative value of J0 for these electrolytes. If you look at these 4 higher Coulombic efficiency electrolytes, though, that was not the case. And in fact, we observed that the J0 value underwent quite a dynamic evolution before eventually stabilizing in most cases. So in that case, we have to really be cautious about portraying an intrinsic or a single representative value. So we became actually quite interested in why high Coulombic efficiencies have increasing J0. You could think that it's a surface area phenomenon, but we tend to see actually lower surface area for higher surface area due to smaller deposits for lower Coulombic efficiency electrolytes compared to higher Coulombic efficiency electrolytes where we see less surface to volume ratio. And so that doesn't apparently explain this observation at first glance. So we propose the following explanation to explain why certain electrolytes see evolution in J0 and why others don't. So in a low Coulombic efficiency SEI, you plate a lithium deposit, and as shown in red here, you form SEI at the surface, and then you strip it and you're left behind with the residual material. If this SEI material inherently has a low exchange current or J0 pseudo value, then it's hard to reuse this pre-existing deposit for plating again, and it pretty much sits there as an inactive material on the surface. So you have to essentially reform the deposit anew, and this would explain why you have to form more surface area or would have a lower Coulombic efficiency. And because you're effectively doing this reformation process again and again, can also help us understand why you would see a pretty flat J0 value over cycling. And you could contrast this with a situation as shown here. So for a high Coulombic efficiency SEI, you plate it and you strip it. And then what's left behind, if it has an inherently high exchange current or exchange rate between the electrolyte and the substrate, it remains active. And so we proposed, again, this is just a hypothesis at the time, but that you can reuse these existing deposits as a kind of scaffold. And so the amount, shown here rather. So the amount of new SEI you have to form would be lower in this scenario, and therefore the Coulombic efficiency is higher. And this would be consistent with the fact that you see an evolving J naught value. In other words, you continue to add to and increase the active surface available for lithium exchange as you continue to add to the scaffold, and then eventually it percolates and you've formed a stable scaffold and you see a leveling off. So at the time, this really was just a proposal, with a schematic to go with it. But I will say in time, we've been focused much more on validating this idea, and we've obtained evidence that this really seems to be sound. So for example, by SEM images, we can now see quite clearly in low Coulombic efficiency and J naught electrolytes, you can actually visualize these kind of dead deposits left behind, and you can see the extensive amounts of dead lithium left behind also. So we really are not effectively reusing a scaffold in any sense of the word. Whereas in the high Coulombic efficiency cases, you do tend to see this kind of deflated looking morphology, which suggests to us that this is more like a membrane that can be reversibly utilized over cycling. So we've extended this. This is ongoing work, but again, looking at a series of electrolytes, we were interested in understanding if this is truly generalizable. So this shows, from high Coulombic efficiency electrolytes such as high concentration FSI and DME down to lower Coulombic efficiency electrolytes. We see expected changes in deposition morphology from larger deposits to smaller deposits as shown here. This is a typical set of SEM images that you'd see after a plating step in a publication. But what's interesting is that we further looked at those morphologies by zooming out. So this is now lower magnification. And what you start to observe is the lack of continuous or percolated deposition as we go from higher to lower Coulombic efficiency. In some cases, you see deposition is really confined to these isolated islands, whereas in the high performance cases, you see more uniform coverage. And this is for the same plated capacity on cycling. We can further look at the electrodes after stripping. And this really, I think, makes the point quite well. So in a high performance case, when you strip, you're left with a material that effectively coats the surface. In the case of lower Coulombic efficiency electrolytes, you see really the disconnection and the failure to form this kind of percolated scaffold or coated surface. And so you're left behind with these isolated domains. Some will be SEI rich. These are dead regions effectively on the electrode, and then some will be lithium rich. These are also dead, but in a different sense, that the lithium could not be stripped. So coming back to that, we're starting to put these pieces of the puzzle together. And so we really think there is something to this idea of an evolving effective scaffold. And then the idea now is really how do we form those intentionally with maximum efficiency and minimum capacity loss? So now I arrive at the last portion of my talk. And I want to zoom out and give a perspective on how we can perhaps apply some of the understanding we've been developing around what we want the SEI to look like. So once we've obtained some ideas for how we would like an improved SEI to look, ultimately it's the electrolyte that affects that. And so we really need to develop stronger links between SEI composition and the corresponding electrolyte states that build those SEI. So that's really the next phase. It's well known in the field that the SEI tends to be built from the coordinated species around the lithium cation. So for example, solvent in pink, anions if they're coordinated. Maybe there's an additive or a second solvent as shown here. What's challenging about this is that this, we have ways of kind of probing the correspondence between the coordination environment and the SEI, but they tend to be rather inefficient and indirect. So the way we really go about this now is we have some hypothesis, we mix some electrolyte ingredients together in a vial as shown here. And then, we wind up with some resulting true electrolyte state that has a distribution of coordination environments. We use spectroscopy to probe the average value of that. Then we go and do a plating stripping experiments. We measure the Coulombic efficiency. We measure the SEI. We may or may not wind up with, a high performance system. And then we kind of infer, okay, maybe if I make this tweak to the electrolyte, I'll get better performance. So we wind up in this rather slow iteration cycle. It would be really compelling if we could unlock the ability to go straight from, electrolyte formulation to a desired average coordination sphere so that we can short circuit this longer iterative process. And really the way to do that is to master the thermodynamics of ion coordination in electrolytes. And so this is something we have humbly become interested in. There's been a massive amount of tremendous work studying electrolyte thermodynamics. We're certainly not the first, but we've been interested in developing a way to use some, let's say, new tools, or at least revisit the use of some old tools to gain insight into modern electrolyte formulations and their coordinating properties. So this is the framework. We've been using isothermal titration calorimetry to probe changes in electrolyte state as we perturb the bulk electrolyte composition. So we were inspired by the use of this method in the field, actually the pharmaceutical or biological field. So this method is used to probe the binding of ligands to macromolecules. Typically what happens is you have a titration calorimeter as shown here. You have a reference vial as shown here. And in the biological case, your reference vial would contain like macromolecules dissolved in a solvent. And then what you do in the experiment is you increasingly inject small amounts of ligand. And because the ligands want to bind to the macromolecules, you have basically spikes in temperature in the sample vial. And so what the instrument does is the controller will seek to maintain the sample vial under isothermal conditions. And so it requires power through a Peltier unit to maintain constant temperature, and then that's what's measured. So you measure these power spikes corresponding to the heat that has to be removed or added as the titration proceeds. So in the biological field, typically you wind up with a graph that looks something like this. So on the x-axis is the extent of titration, and then the y-axis is the delta H measured per injection. So you're directly converting the power measured to the corresponding enthalpy required to keep things isothermal, or in other words, the delta enthalpy of the reaction that took place. And in a well-behaved system where there's a high reaction affinity, you see this kind of sigmoidal response here. And so typically most of the injected ligand will bind, and so you measure a strong and relatively constant interaction. And then as you start to saturate binding sites, there's a transition, and then you go to 0 with respect to injecting the ligand into the baseline. And so when you have a high affinity reaction, this is the ideal case because you can determine in one reaction sweep the key thermodynamic parameters. You can get the delta H of a ligand binding to a site. You know how much was injected, so you can normalize this to a per mole or per interaction basis. The transition here and the steepness will tell you about the delta G of the reaction, and that allows you to get to the entropy of the interaction. And then also you can determine the extent of the reaction or the stoichiometry N. If you have a low affinity reaction, you still get valuable information, but you can't independently determine delta G, delta H, and delta S. So we were interested in seeing if we could apply this analogy to studying electrolytes. And so to do that, we have to construct a model system or define the system of study. And so we humbly started with a relatively simple system in this first report. The system we investigate is a cation, lithium, that is initially coordinated in a weakly coordinating solvent. I will talk a little bit more about what we chose subsequently, but this tends to be predictive by the solvent donor number. So we use things like PC or acetonitrile. And we ensure that the anion is not paired in the initial state, such that we're really not probing changes in anion interactions over the extent of the titration. And then we introduce small injections of a stronger solvent, so as predicted by a high donor number. Typically, we're using DMSO, but other strong solvents work too. And what happens is a strong solvent will start to displace the weakly coordinating solvent in the coordination environment. And then if that happens, you'll see a heat release corresponding to that process. And so here's how the typical data look. I'll try to go through this so I can wrap up in the next couple of minutes or so. But what you see here on the right-hand side, this is the cumulative enthalpy change with respect to, this is normalized with respect to a baseline. So we've corrected for example, dilution effects and the heat of injection of the strong solvent into the weak solvent alone. And then on the left-hand side, we normalize this on a per injection basis, and shown here. And so the orange can be compared with the framework over here. And what we see for the electrolyte is that this follows a low affinity reaction as opposed to the high affinity reactions that you see in typical biological scenarios. I want to mention that we're doing these at relatively low concentration. So we start at 0.1 molar, and then because we're injecting solvent, we wind up at a slightly lower concentration by the end. And this actually shows the case for two weak solvents, acetonitrile PC, and the strong solvent in this case was DMSO. So because we cannot deconvolute this directly to get the thermodynamic information we're interested in, we developed a second parallelized titration that we conduct in an electrochemical cell. So we took inspiration from work by Each-Way's group. Apologize that the reference has not made it into this slide. But we can observe how the delta G changes as we increasingly inject the strong solvent into the weak solvent, thereby changing the coordination shell of the lithium. And you see that the OCV creeps up due to the negative delta G of this displacement reaction. And then this just shows that we can do this for other strong solvents. And so this shows how the titration data look, and then this shows how the OCV data look. And so now we have two data sets. So to unify them, we have to develop a binding model that allows us to basically fit both of them consistently and then extract the underlying parameters. So I don't have time to get into all of the statistical thermodynamics in this setting. If you'd like to see the details, I refer you to our work. But in brief, we are modeling a sequential solvent displacement reaction. So we start with lithium coordinated by a weakly coordinated solvent, and then we look at what happens as we increasingly displace on average 1, 2, 3, and 4 binding sites by strong solvent. The assumptions here are that the cation has independent and identical binding sites. We actually don't have to assume the number of binding sites. We can validate that through the fitting, and we get a binding number of around four coordination sites. We can independently validate that by spectroscopy measurement, so that's nice. And this allows us to independently determine or extract the delta H and also the delta G. So apologies for going quickly through the model, but basically we fit the two data sets and then we get all access to the thermodynamic information. And so this is I believe my last slide, just to emphasize what we can do with this information once we've obtained it. So this shows, for example, the fraction of strong solvent in the bulk and the fraction of that strong solvent that will enter the coordination sphere of the cation. So you'll see that for strong solvents, and this is a acetonitrile, I believe, weak solvent in this case, sorry, PC. As we introduce relatively small amounts of the strong solvent, because they're driven to coordinate preferentially, you get kind of proportionally higher representation in the coordination sphere compared to their fraction in the bulk. You can imagine that this can be useful if we're thinking about, for instance, how much of an additive to put into an electrolyte to promote binding. We can also now start to predict what drives the establishment of different coordination environments. For example, it's always more favorable to displace PC by DMSO if we have enough DMSO available. But we can also see what's driving that. In this case, it's a negative enthalpy, but also entropic effects contribute quite markedly. And now we can also look at the evolution of the populations in solution. So this is the probability of different complexes, not like a complex number probability, but the probability of different complexes in solution as we increase the fraction of DMSO in the bulk. So initially, primarily lithium PC4, but then we start to go through different coordination environments that will minimize the global free energy, and eventually that corresponds to a overwhelming dominance of the DMSO coordinated states. So finally, the key question is, once we can predict this, now we can develop testable hypotheses that allow us to say, what's the difference of having 1, 2, 3, or 4, let's say DMSO coordinated on average, and how that affects the resulting Coulombic efficiency and SEI composition. So I hope that gives you a flavor for how we're trying to bring things full circle. I will conclude there. And I want to make sure to acknowledge my tremendous research group. There are many contributors. I've highlighted some of them here that I've specifically focused on their work in this presentation, and also funding sources, and really want to thank you for your attention and look forward to answering some questions. Thank you very much.